It always starts with a feeling, a magnetic pull that you can't explain. She sees you, or at least it feels that way. Her gaze lingers a little longer than most. Her words are soft, deliberate, perfectly timed to disarm your defenses. And before you realize what's happening, you're hooked. But what if I told you that what you're feeling isn't love? That what feels like destiny might actually be a psychological trap, one that Carl Jung saw, named, and warned us about long before we had the words to describe it. Because the most dangerous kind of woman isn't the one who yells, breaks things, or openly destroys. She's far more subtle. She operates in the shadows, not because she's evil, but because she doesn't know her own unconscious. And when someone doesn't know their shadow, they don't control it. It controls them. That's where the real danger begins. You meet her in a moment when you're vulnerable. Maybe you're in a transition, emotionally uncertain, or just lonely enough to ignore your own red flags. She appears calm, curious, emotionally tuned in. She asks you deep questions, mirrors your soul, makes you feel like you've finally been seen. But here's the truth, she's not seeing you. She's projecting. She's constructing an image in her mind, a fantasy that you've just been cast into. And as long as you stay in character, the story continues. The affection, the connection, the illusion of something real. But the moment you break script, the mood shifts. Carl Jung warned that we don't fall in love with people, we fall in love with our projections of them. And when those projections are rooted in unresolved trauma, in shadow material that's never been integrated, what we call love can become a battlefield for the unconscious. This woman, the one Jung would have called possessed by the animus, doesn't know she's playing a role. She's not plotting. She's not calculating. That would require conscious awareness. No, she is living out a script that was written long before you ever appeared. One shaped by 1,000 tiny wounds, by abandonment, emotional neglect, betrayal. And now you're standing in front of her, carrying the weight of every man who ever disappointed her. At first, it's intoxicating. She adores you, studies you, speaks your language before you even teach it to her. But eventually you notice a change. The emotional weather turns cold without warning. You feel it before you understand it. The affection retracts, the compliments stop, the closeness disappears. And you start to chase, trying to find your way back to that initial high. That's when the trap tightens. This is not ordinary dysfunction. This is a shadow dance. She isn't consciously manipulating you, but her unconscious is. The sudden withdrawal, it triggers your fear of abandonment. Her shifting moods, they activate your need to fix, to prove, to be chosen again. And each time you respond, you feed the pattern. You don't even realize you've become emotionally addicted to trying to win back something that was never real in the first place. Jung taught that the anima, the feminine part of the male psyche, is often projected onto women. When undeveloped, this projection can be disastrous. You don't see her as she is, you see her as you need her to be. The nurturing one, the muse, the healer of your pain. And as long as she plays the role, your fantasy stays alive. But the moment she deviates, when her real self starts to bleed through the cracks, you either try to save her, or you begin to resent. And here's the deeper wound. You start believing the problem is you. You start walking on eggshells. You internalize her silence as a failure on your part. You try harder. You become more available, more attentive, more agreeable. Until one day you realize you've abandoned yourself completely. You don't recognize the man in the mirror anymore. This is what Jung meant when he warned us about being consumed by unconscious archetypes. When a woman is possessed by her unintegrated animus, when her inner masculine is wounded, critical, or fragmented, she doesn't relate to men as they are. She relates to them through the lens of her own psychological war. And if you happen to step into her life at the wrong time, you're not a partner, you're a proxy. But this isn't just about her. This is about you too. Because no one ends up in this kind of dynamic by accident. If you're drawn to a woman like this, it's because some part of you still believes love is earned, that affection must be chased, that inconsistency is passion, and that chaos is normal. That belief didn't start with her, it started long before. Maybe in childhood, maybe in your first heartbreak. Somewhere along the line you confused emotional volatility with connection. And now, without realizing it, you're repeating the pattern, hoping this time it will end differently. This is how shadow relationships are formed. Two unconscious minds colliding, projecting, reacting, seducing and punishing, all while calling it intimacy. And the longer you stay, the more you lose. Not just time, not just energy, but parts of your soul, your clarity, your confidence, your center. Carl Jung believed the only way out was through integration. You must become aware of the forces driving your attraction. You must see her, not as a savior, not as a seductress, not as a villain, but as a mirror. She reflects your unhealed wounds, your unmet needs, and your unconscious fantasies. And until you recognize that, you'll keep mistaking the intensity of the connection for love. But here's the hardest truth. She's not going to change. Not because she's incapable, but because she has no reason to. As long as you keep playing the role, the story continues. If you want out, you have to stop participating. You have to stop explaining, stop defending, stop chasing. You have to withdraw, not as punishment, but as self-preservation. Because the most dangerous kind of woman isn't the one who hates you. It's the one who loves you without knowing why, who pulls you in without understanding the gravity of her own wounds, who seduces with sincerity, then destroys without awareness, not because she's malicious, but because she's unconscious. And if you're not careful, you'll lose yourself trying to be enough for a woman who's not even present. She's not here with you. She's reliving her past through you, and you're doing the same. So how do you break the cycle? How do you extract yourself from something so emotionally entangled that it feels like leaving her would be the same as tearing out a piece of your own psyche? The answer isn't easy, but it is clear. You have to begin by waking up to the psychological reality of the situation. Not the fantasy, not the potential, not the highs that felt like love, but the pattern, the loop, the manipulation. Conscious or not, you must ask yourself not how you feel about her, but who you've become because of her. That's the real metric. Not how beautiful the connection was in the beginning, but how lost you feel now. Because real love doesn't confuse you. It doesn't keep you guessing. It doesn't reward your vulnerability one day and punish it the next. Real love is rooted in presence, not projection. It grows in clarity, not chaos. If you feel like you've been walking through a psychological maze where the walls keep shifting, you're not in love. You're in a trauma loop. Jung said that what we do not make conscious will continue to operate in our lives as fate. That's what's happening here. You've been caught in a relationship that feels out of your control, but the truth is, it's being governed by parts of you that you've never examined. This isn't just about her being dangerous, it's about the danger of your own unconscious attachments. She becomes a mirror for your forgotten self. She shows you where you still seek approval, where you still think suffering earns you love, where you still confuse emotional drama with intimacy. And that mirror is painful to look at, but it's also the key to your freedom, because once you see it, you can never unsee it. Once you recognize the pattern, the spell begins to break. But let's be clear, breaking the spell doesn't mean she'll stop trying to pull you back in. It often means the opposite. The moment you step back, the moment you stop reacting, she will feel the shift. She may become sweeter, more affectionate, even apologetic. She may tell you that she sees it now, that she wants to change, and maybe she believes that. But belief isn't transformation, insight isn't integration. Jung understood that individuation, becoming whole, requires confrontation, not just with others, but with the deepest parts of yourself. That means you don't just leave her, You look inward and ask, why did I stay so long? What was I really chasing? What wound was I hoping she would heal? Until you answer those questions, you'll leave her and find someone just like her, different face, same archetype. Because your psyche is still trying to resolve the original wound through repetition. That's what the unconscious does. It recreates familiar pain in the hope that this time you'll become conscious enough to change your response. So the real work isn't about her at all. It's about you. It's about pulling back every projection, every story, every rationalization you've used to keep the illusion alive. It's about owning your complicity in the dynamic. That doesn't mean blaming yourself for her behavior. It means taking responsibility for the role you played in sustaining it. Were you avoiding your own loneliness? Did her chaos distract you from facing your own emptiness? Were you trying to rescue her so you wouldn't have to rescue yourself? These are hard questions, but they are necessary ones. Because what makes this kind of woman dangerous isn't her power, it's your blindness to your own. It's the way you hand over your center in exchange for affection, the way you abandon your clarity for the high of being desired, the way you confuse intensity with meaning and control with care. Once you see that, once you realize that the danger was never just in her but in the unhealed parts of you that led you to her, you start to reclaim your power. You begin to detach, not out of bitterness, but out of clarity, not to punish her, but to protect yourself. This is where the transformation begins. You stop needing to explain yourself. You stop needing her to understand. You stop hoping for closure, because you realize closure doesn't come from her. It comes from the moment you choose to stop participating in your own erosion. Jung said that individuation is the process of becoming who you are. That requires you to break free from roles, from projections, from fantasies that keep you entangled in dynamics that drain your soul. And sometimes that process begins with walking away from someone who once felt like home. But you also realize they only felt like home because home for you was always unpredictable, always unstable, always just out of reach. And when you finally step out of that familiar chaos, you don't just leave her behind. You leave behind a version of yourself who thought love had to hurt, who thought love had to be earned, who thought love meant losing yourself. And slowly you start to rebuild. At first, the silence feels unbearable. The void she left behind echoes with every memory, every promise, every moment that felt real. But then something unexpected happens. That silence becomes spacious. You start hearing your own thoughts again, feeling your own feelings without someone else's mood dictating your state of being. You begin to see how much energy you were spending on managing her emotions, decoding her silences, bracing for her storms. And then you see it. You weren't in love, you were in survival. That's the moment something shifts. The fog lifts. You feel your boundaries returning. You remember who you were before you met her. Or maybe you meet that version of yourself for the first time. And you understand what Jung meant when he said, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. You don't become that person by being chosen. You become that person by choosing yourself. You don't become strong by enduring toxicity. You become strong by recognizing it and walking away. You don't become whole by saving someone else. You become whole by rescuing the parts of you that once thought you needed saving. The most dangerous kind of woman is not a villain. She's a wake-up call, a mirror, a teacher. Not because she teaches you how to love, but because she teaches you how not to abandon yourself again. And when you finally learn that lesson, you won't need revenge. You won't need to prove your worth. You'll simply rise quietly, steadily, completely, and you'll never confuse intensity for intimacy again. But before that kind of clarity can take root, there's one more layer you have to confront: the guilt. Because even when you know the relationship is unhealthy, even when your rational mind understands it's time to leave, Your emotional body still remembers the highs. It still hears her laughter, still feels her skin, still replays the moments that felt sacred. And that's where most men get stuck, not in the present pain, but in the memory of potential. You tell yourself maybe it was your fault, maybe you weren't patient enough, sensitive enough, understanding enough. You remember the times she cried in your arms, told you her secrets, opened up in ways no one else had seen. You hold on to those fragments as proof that it was real, that it wasn't all shadow. And here's the painful truth. It was real, but real doesn't mean healthy. Real doesn't mean right. Real doesn't mean safe for your soul. Carl Jung never said the shadow was fake. He said it was unconscious, and when someone is unconscious of the impact they have, the pain they cause doesn't come with guilt. It comes with justification. She'll say you're too sensitive, that you misunderstood her, that you're twisting things. She might cry, apologize, make promises, not because she's lying, but because she doesn't understand the part of herself that's wreaking havoc. She doesn't know her own shadow, and until she does, she will keep bleeding on everyone who tries to love her. And you can't fix that. You can't love someone out of their unconscious. You can't force someone to see a part of themselves they've spent their entire life avoiding. And the more you try, the more you lose. This is why detachment is necessary, not just physical distance, but emotional detachment, the ability to observe without absorbing, to witness her pain without making it yours to heal, to hear her stories without needing to save her. Because the moment you take responsibility for her emotional reality, you sacrifice your own. You begin to disappear, slowly, quietly, in ways you don't even notice at first. You stop speaking up. You downplay your needs. You tell yourself to be more patient, more understanding. And every time you do, you shrink. Not because you're weak, but because you've been conditioned to think that love means self-abandonment, that being a good man means being endlessly available, endlessly forgiving, endlessly silent. But Carl Jung had a different definition of strength. He said that true strength is in wholeness, and wholeness is not passive, it is not self-erasing, it is not about becoming so adaptable that you forget your own shape. Wholeness means knowing who you are and refusing to compromise that truth, even for someone you love. Because love, without self, is not love. It's fusion, it's enmeshment, it's codependency dressed up as devotion, and the woman who unconsciously feeds off your energy, your attention, your constant availability, isn't looking for a partner, she's looking for a container, someone to hold the weight of emotions she hasn't learned to carry, someone to soothe the chaos she hasn't dared to confront. And if you keep stepping into that role, you'll become her emotional caretaker, her mirror, her scapegoat, and in the process, you'll forget that you ever had wounds of your own. This is why the work of reclaiming your psyche is urgent, not later, not when she changes, now. Because the longer you stay, the deeper the fusion becomes, the harder it is to distinguish her voice from your own. You'll begin to doubt your instincts. You'll question your perception of reality. You'll feel guilty for feeling resentful, ashamed for needing space. And eventually, you'll wonder if the problem is you. This is how psychological entanglement works. It's not overt control, it's subtle, it's energetic, it bypasses logic and roots itself in your nervous system. You become hyper-aware of her moods, her reactions, her silence. You develop a sixth sense, not for intimacy, but for survival. And the most terrifying part? You'll call it love. But it's not love, it's trauma reenactment. Jung taught that we are drawn to those who reflect our unconscious back to us, not because we're doomed, but because the psyche is always seeking integration, always trying to bring what's hidden into the light. That's why you felt so drawn to her. That's why the connection felt cosmic, because she wasn't just a person, she was a reflection of your own forgotten pain. Maybe you had a mother who was emotionally volatile. Maybe love was always inconsistent. Maybe you were taught that your needs were too much, or your silence was the only way to keep peace. And then she arrived, familiar, intoxicating, painful in all the same places. Your psyche recognized her not as love, but as home. And here's the catch: home is not always safe. Sometimes home is where you learned to hide, to adapt, to earn attention. And now, as an adult, you're still trying to rewrite that original script, hoping that this time, if you just love hard enough, stay long enough, suffer patiently enough, it will finally work. That this time love will stay. But it won't. Not until you stop outsourcing your healing to someone who doesn't even know they're bleeding. You must become conscious of your patterns, your projections, your pain. You must learn to sit in the discomfort of your own wounds without reaching for someone else to soothe them. You must develop emotional sovereignty, the ability to regulate your inner world without external validation, because only then can you see clearly. Only then can you love without losing yourself. Carl Jung called this individuation, the lifelong process of becoming whole, of integrating your shadow, of confronting the unconscious forces that drive your life. And yes, it is lonely, it is brutal, but it is the only path that leads to freedom. Because once you see the dynamic, you can never unsee it. Once you feel what it's like to choose yourself, even when it hurts, even when you're terrified, even when your heart is breaking, you change. Not into someone harder, but into someone more awake. You become the man who no longer mistakes chaos for chemistry, who no longer confuses rescuing for relating, who no longer shrinks himself to fit into someone else's emotional void. You become the man who sees clearly and walks away not because he doesn't care, but because he finally does. For himself, for his peace, for the life he's no longer willing to sacrifice for someone else's unconscious drama. And when you reach that point, everything changes. Because when you start choosing clarity over chaos, you begin to feel something you haven't felt in a long time. Power. Not dominance, not control, but true, quiet, grounded power. The kind that doesn't need to chase, the kind that doesn't explain itself to people committed to misunderstanding it, the kind that stands alone. Not because it wants to be alone, but because it refuses to lose itself ever again. And with that power comes space, mental space, emotional space, space to think without noise, to breathe without tension, to feel without fear of repercussion. You begin to reclaim your time, your energy, your sense of self. The psychic fog starts to lift. You start to remember what your voice sounds like without distortion. You reconnect with parts of yourself that were buried under years of people-pleasing, conflict avoidance, and emotional caretaking. At first, it's disorienting. You've lived so long in survival mode that peace feels suspicious, silence feels empty, calm feels like the absence of something. You wait for the next explosion, the next text that shatters your calm, the next emotional storm that pulls you back in. But eventually those storms stop coming because you've stepped out of the storm cycle. You've stopped feeding the pattern. And then something even more profound happens. You feel loneliness. Not the kind that makes you run back to what hurt you, but the kind that makes you sit with yourself and finally ask, who am I without this chaos? That's the beginning of individuation. When you stop identifying with the role you played in someone else's emotional drama and start building a self that isn't based on being needed, being approved of, or being chosen. Carl Jung wrote that the first half of life is about constructing a persona and the second half is about dismantling it. That persona, the mask you wore in the relationship, wasn't just about her. It was about survival. It was about being the man you thought you had to be to earn love. But love, that must be earned, is never love. It's a transaction rooted in fear. So you take the mask off, piece by piece, And it hurts, because that mask got you through a lot. It protected you, it made you feel safe, but it also kept you from being seen, from being known, from being whole. And that's when you meet the part of yourself that you've been avoiding this whole time, the part that's terrified of being alone, of being misunderstood, of not being enough. You sit with that part. You don't try to fix him. You don't shame him. You just stay. And slowly you realize that this is the man you've been running from, the one underneath the role, the one underneath the reaction, the one who never got the love he needed and thought that if he could just make her happy, maybe he would finally feel complete. But she was never the answer. She was the mirror. That's why Jung didn't just teach about others, he taught us to turn inward. Because your deepest healing won't come from someone finally choosing you, it comes from you choosing to see yourself fully, with all your scars, your needs, your mistakes, and your forgotten dreams. And still saying, I'm worthy. That's the energy that no one can manipulate. That's the presence that can't be seduced into performing. That's the man who walks into a room and doesn't need to prove anything, because he's not there to be admired. He's there to be real. When you reach that point, the way you see women changes, the way you love changes. You no longer chase intensity, you seek resonance. You no longer fall for projection, you crave presence. You no longer confuse emotional labor with intimacy. You know that love doesn't feel like walking on glass, it feels like coming home. And you start to spot the patterns early. You notice when someone's affection feels more like a test, when their vulnerability feels like bait, when their silence feels weaponized, not because you're paranoid, but because you're awake. And being awake doesn't mean you reject love, it means you know how to protect it. You know how to protect you. This is the path Jung laid out, a path of psychological sovereignty, of spiritual integration, of confronting your inner world so that no one else can use it against you. And yes, it's a lonely path at times, because not everyone wants to walk it, not everyone wants to give up their illusions, but the ones who do, those are the ones who become whole. And when you become whole, you stop seeking someone to complete you, you start seeking someone to walk beside you. Not because you need them, but because you choose them. That's what makes you dangerous in the best possible way, because a man who no longer fears solitude is a man who cannot be manipulated. A man who no longer craves validation is a man who cannot be used. A man who knows his own shadow is a man who cannot be destroyed by someone else. And the most dangerous kind of woman? She has no power over a man like that, not because he's hardened, but because he's healed. He sees her. He has compassion for her, but he will not bleed for her. He will not shrink to soothe her. He will not hand over his truth in exchange for temporary comfort, because he knows that true connection can only exist between two integrated souls, not between one who is awake and one who is still dreaming. So if you've been in the grip of this dynamic, if you've felt like you're losing your mind trying to hold on to someone who's constantly slipping through your fingers, it's time to stop asking what's wrong with you and start asking what you're still refusing to see. Because the truth isn't in her eyes, it's in your patterns, the ones that led you to her, the ones that kept you there, the ones that will repeat unless you break the cycle consciously. And when you do, when you finally walk away not because you hate her, but because you've remembered how to love yourself, everything begins to change, not overnight, not all at once, but piece by piece. You return, not to who you were before her, but to the man who existed long before the wounds. The man who no longer fears being misunderstood. The man who no longer begs to be seen. The man who sees himself and never forgets it again. Because that's where the journey ends. Not in rage, not in bitterness, not even in regret. It ends in clarity. In knowing that the most dangerous thing wasn't her, it was the part of you that refused to see. the part of you that tolerated emotional starvation because it looked like the love you were conditioned to crave. The part that mistook survival for connection, chaos for chemistry, pain for proof that it mattered. But now you know better. Now you've seen behind the curtain. You've faced the myth of the dangerous woman and found something far more sobering. She is not evil. She is unconscious. And the more unconscious she is, the more power you give her when you abandon your awareness. That's what Jung warned us about. The shadow is not some monster in the dark. It is what we refuse to acknowledge. And when we look away, it grows. She carries her own shadow. Maybe it came from betrayal, from rejection, from years of pretending. Maybe she learned to weaponize her pain because that was the only way she could feel heard. Maybe the withdrawal, the hot and cold, the punishment and praise. Maybe it was her way of keeping control in a world that once made her feel powerless. But that's not your burden to carry. You don't have to bleed for every woman who doesn't know how to love. You don't have to justify her moods, explain away her contradictions, or bend yourself into something unrecognizable to be worthy. You were never meant to play the role of emotional hostage just to feel needed. Your worth isn't defined by your ability to endure dysfunction. It's defined by your willingness to walk away from it. And that's where real healing begins, not in fixing her, but in reclaiming the parts of you that thought you had to. You start saying no, not because you're cold, but because you've stopped betraying yourself. You set boundaries, not to control others, but to protect your peace. You stop explaining, stop defending, stop auditioning for love that was never yours to begin with. And when the silence comes, when no one is there to tell you what to feel, who to be, how to act, you realize that this is what it means to be free. At first the silence feels brutal, but then it becomes beautiful. Because in that silence, you hear the sound of your own soul again. You remember who you are. The man who sees clearly. The man who acts with intention. The man who doesn't trade his essence for emotional crumbs. And you begin to rebuild not just a life, but a way of being. You engage with people differently. You notice manipulation before it hooks you. You catch yourself before slipping back into the role of rescuer. You honor your gut. You trust your body. You speak truth even when it shakes your voice. Because you no longer need to be chosen. You've already chosen yourself. And this new presence, this grounded, sovereign presence, becomes your compass. It's what keeps you steady when charm tries to seduce you. It's what keeps you strong when guilt tries to pull you back. It's what makes you resilient when loneliness whispers its lies. You are no longer afraid of walking alone, because you are no longer afraid of yourself. That's the paradox. When you face the dangerous woman and survive the psychological unraveling she triggers, you don't just recover, you awaken. You realize she wasn't your end, she was your initiation. She introduced you to your shadow, and now you know it by name. No more blaming, no more rescuing, no more hoping she'll change. You change. You go inward. You do the work Jung prescribed: shadow integration, psychic awareness, emotional maturity. You become the kind of man who no longer seeks chaos for excitement. You become the kind of man who chooses peace not because he's afraid of depth, but because he understands that real depth doesn't come from dysfunction, it comes from wholeness. And when you meet someone new, you don't fall blindly. You don't confuse fantasy with reality. You observe. You stay connected to yourself. You watch how they handle your no, how they respond to your needs, whether their affection grows in truth or only thrives in performance. You don't expect perfection, but you demand presence. Because now you're not looking for someone to complete you. You're looking for someone who's done the work too. And when you find her, The woman who knows her own shadow, who speaks with clarity, who loves without control, you'll feel the difference. There will be no emotional hostage-taking, no confusing silences, no need to guess where you stand. Just two people grounded in self meeting in truth. That is real intimacy. That is the reward for every tear shed, every illusion shattered, every part of you that died in the fire of unconscious love. You didn't lose in that relationship. You were forged. And now you are a man with eyes wide open. You are no longer seduced by the dangerous woman. You're seen behind the mask. You faced your own shadow, and you are free.